Reputation determines how factions treat the player. There are 4 brackets with unique characteristics: hostile, unfriendly, neutral, and friendly. Some of these characteristics are superficial, like troops having different lines of dialogue to acknowledge your presence in an area,
Keep an eye on the merc.
or faction leaders having different lines of dialogue inside of HQs.
Who the hell are you?
Some game mechanics are also affected, though. The reputation required for not being shot on sight is unfriendly or higher. The reputation required for hijacking vehicles, which includes helicopters in flight, is neutral or lower.
What the hell?
And the reputation required for commandeering vehicles, which excludes helicopters in flight, is friendly.
Let's roll!
Note the key difference between being neutral and friendly. If your reputation with a faction is friendly, there's no way to gain control of helicopters being flown by that faction other than pilot sniping. This is important for Black Hawk hijacking during ace contracts, which is more thoroughly explained in a separate fundamentals video. Factions will sometimes treat you as hostile and open fire if you conduct hostile acts, like shooting or killing their troops, damaging their buildings, or killing civilians. And while I want to say that a faction's propensity to open fire is affected by the player's current reputation bracket, I haven't been able to substantiate a consistent pattern. Suffice to say that factions treat you differently at different reputations, and I think they may also treat you differently depending on whether or not you're currently in a contract. These nuances aren't super relevant for speedruns, but the way the reputation system works in general is very important to understand. It's more or less a simple point-based system. Reputation is stored as a float for each faction, which ranges from -1 to 1. To simplify things, we'll call it 0 to 200 and ignore decimals. Hostile is classified as 0 through 40 points. Unfriendly is 41 through 80 points. Neutral is 81 through 120, and friendly is 121 through 200. Reputation can be lowered by killing faction members, which is -20 points if witnessed, subduing an officer for -20 points, subduing a South Korean, Chinese, or Mafia grunt for -10, subduing an allied grunt for -7.5, yeah, it's weird, killing civilians, which is -5 for South Korea and China, and -10 for the Allies with no change for the Mafia, killing HQ guards for -200 points, destroying an HQ for -200 points if witnessed, and destroying key structures, like the Mafia garage or tents near Chinese headquarters, which is -100 points if witnessed. Reputation can be raised by killing North Koreans, which is +1 point if witnessed, killing enemy faction members, which is +5 points if witnessed, destroying a listening post, which is +5 for China, collecting a national treasure, which is also +5 for China, collecting a blueprint, which is +5 for South Korea, destroying a monument, which is +25 for South Korea, selling vehicles, which is +5 for the Mafia, completing a contract, which is variable between contracts and based on whether or not you complete bonus objectives. This can range from +10 points to +60 points, and possibly even more. We haven't tested every contract. Completing a faction-aligned challenge contract. I think all of these are +20 points, but we haven't tested all of them. Bribing via an HQ guard, which raises reputation to 60 points. Starting a contract, which raises reputation to 41 points. And medevacing, which raises your reputation with the Allies to 41. All of these techniques can be used during runs to manipulate reputation as desired. Note one of the last methods for raising mood, starting a contract. At first, this may seem impossible. If the player's reputation is 40 or lower, they should be considered hostile and therefore should not be able to enter an HQ to start a contract without first bribing the faction. However, there is a strat called tax evasion, wherein the player can actually enter a faction's HQ while considered hostile. Then, after accepting a contract from that faction, your mood will be raised to 41 points. This is accomplished by turning the faction hostile after you have already initiated dialogue with the HQ guard. For example, imagine if you have 45 reputation points with South Korea and are standing in front of their HQ. You throw a grenade at a nearby civilian, but initiate conversation with the HQ guard before that grenade detonates. If the civilian is killed before you enter the HQ, your reputation will drop by 5 points to 40, making you hostile with South Korea. Accepting their contract will bump you back up to unfriendly at 41 points. Another way to pull this off is to regain control of your player after initiating conversation with the HQ guard. This is not typically allowed, but there's a glitch you can execute to make this happen. Just swap your weapon right before initiating conversation with the guard. After your weapon is finished swapping, you will regain control of your player and can shoot nearby faction members, civilians, blow up the HQ, etc. This is one of the main strategies for Merc speedruns. For example, it's used early in any percent runs to simplify Mafia Contract warps. Upon approaching the Mafia HQ prior to starting bait and switch, 2 AT missiles are fired from the player's MD500 at the Mafia HQ to weaken it. Then, just before talking to the HQ guard, a final handheld AT missile is fired at the base of the building. Before the missile makes contact, dialogue is initiated with the HQ guard. The HQ is destroyed and the player's reputation with the Mafia is set to 0, but the player is still brought into the HQ. Accepting the contract bumps their reputation up to 41 points. Now, even if the player kills up to 19 of the Mafia's enemies for plus 19 points, killing just one Mafia soldier will lower their reputation by negative 20 to 40 points or lower, i.e. hostile, and instantly fail the contract. This makes warping out of bait and switch and playing the odds much more consistent than if we were to bribe the Mafia, which would bump the player's reputation all the way up to 60 points. If we're at 60 points and kill just one enemy, we'll bump the Mafia's mood up to 61. Now we have to kill 2 soldiers to make them hostile. Because of how critical faction reputation is for executing important strategies, it can be helpful to use an on-screen indicator, like Scotch tape with marked lines, to indicate the exact range wherein, for example, killing a single civilian would turn a faction hostile. I recently added a mark to my TV that indicates the space between 40 and 45 points of South Korean reputation. It's mostly a minor convenience, but can come in handy when things don't go exactly as planned. There is one important caveat with reputation. During new game playthroughs, any percent, ACC, etc., there is a flag at the start of the game that prevents factions from being turned hostile. This flag is permanently lifted if the player completes China's first contract, Pest Control, or if the player enters the Diamonds chapter of the game. The flag is also lifted for bringing down the house, the Ace of Clubs contract, but is reinstated if the player quits that contract and hasn't yet finished Pest Control. For new game speedruns, this means that, to the best of our knowledge, the player must complete Pest Control in order to warp from the Mafia's 3rd contract, Bait and Switch, to their 4th contract, Playing the Odds, thus skipping the Ace of Clubs. This is because there is no contract essential object that can be destroyed during Bait and Switch. Furthermore, for the same reason, warping out of South Korea's first contract, Stem the Tide, is also impossible during new game runs. The only way we know of to circumvent this flag is by using the cheat code to reset all faction moods, which is not allowed in any of the current categories. There's a whole bunch of other weirdness and nuances that go into this reputation system, but for the sake of brevity and my own sanity, I'm not going to cover them in this video. For example, if you execute a series of specific steps, you can actually start contracts while hostile with a faction, but it's very unlikely that you would do this on accident during a run. Remember, these values are actually being stored as a float, not an integer, so we think that this behavior is due to some strange rounding in the game, but we can't say for sure without being able to look into the code. One final thing worth noting. Actions that require a witness, such as killing faction members, can be quite finicky to execute consistently due to the game's unusual stealth system, which will be covered in the next Fundamentals video on stealth.